everybody. The idea of a hot version of a normal car is far from new. In fact, back in the 1960s, when some bright spark had the idea of putting a green stripe on the side of a Ford, it wasn't particularly novel. However, if you want a special version of an already special car, your choice hasn't always been quite so generous. Today though, the selection of hardcore, lightweight, track-focused cars is almost overwhelming, with everything from established players like Caterham to relatively new options like those from McLaren, and, if you're particularly well-heeled, a plethora of ultra-exclusive track toys for the super rich. There are things like the Lotus Evija, the Ford GT. There are also some new companies springing up with old names like the De Tomaso, and even luxury brands have got in on the action too, with both Bugatti and Aston Martin having made more track-focused and sporty versions of their existing cars. It's almost a shock now to see a new car from a manufacturer that fits that description, which doesn't cost more than a nice house. In 2010, things seemed a little bit more easy. You could have gone and bought something like a Caterham. There were still plenty of nobles about, but if you wanted a more mainstream brand, you didn't really have that much choice. You could go and buy something like a 911 GT3 or something like this, the Ferrari 430 Scuderia. I happen to be particularly attached to this car, not just because it's mine, but because I also think it represents a peak in motoring, a time when computer-aided design and technology was making cars faster and safer without making them less fun, when we still had somewhat raw analog technologies like the single-clutch automated gearbox, but that had been refined to a point where they actually worked. These were also cars not sold in enormous quantities, not flipped for massive profits. In fact, the first owners of stuff like this and the equivalent GT3 RS lost money, because these were the cars that only appealed to the people that were actually going to drive them. How different the world was. I also happen to think this represents the final era where these kind of cars were truly pretty, with stuff like many of your modern offerings, even from Porsche, being somewhat outrageous and looking like a race car from only a few years ago. Many a magazine and TV program would have you believe that the only choice was always between Porsche and Ferrari. But if you took just a short trip from Modena over to Sant'Agata, you would find there was an alternative with a bull on the front. This is a 2013 Lamborghini Gallardo LP570-4 Superleggera. On paper, it's about as close as you can get to my 430 Scuderia. However, in reality, it's a very different beast. When I say on paper the two are similar, I really mean it. They are virtually twins. So, both cars have an aluminium chassis. Both cars have chiefly aluminium bodywork. Both of them are the stripped-out, lightweight take on a very popular mid-engine supercar. This based on the LP570-4 Gallardo and the Ferrari on the F430. Both of them are significantly lighter than the regular cars, thanks in part to healthy doses of carbon fibre, outside and in. Lamborghini claim this car is 70 kilos lighter than the regular Gallardo, and independent websites have verified that. In fact, one that I use says that it's actually closer to a 90 kilo difference. On the outside, you have carbon fibre side skirts, carbon fibre rear diffuser, carbon fibre engine lid, carbon fibre spoiler, and carbon fibre wing mirrors. I'm sure I've missed some other bits too, but that's a healthy amount and comparable to the 430 Scuderia. Inside, you have these glorious carbon fibre door cards, carbon fibre fixed bucket seats, a carbon fibre central tunnel. All things the 430 has as well. The main difference being, in the 430, the seats do fold by default. Here, they do not. Each car also has a steering wheel with a bit of carbon, a dash with plenty of carbon, and switchgear that is now somewhat out of date. The suspension is also similar. Both cars have double wishbone, front and rear. Brakes, again, both cars have carbon ceramics, though on the Scuderia they were standard and here they were an option. This car was an ex-Lamborghini demonstrator, so comes with all of the boxes ticked. Unfortunately, I haven't in my quest been able to find an original price list for one of these to be able to tell you exactly what was and wasn't an option. For example, that carbon fibre engine bay cover with the nice window on it, I believe is standard. The wing though, I think is not. These cars were also priced similarly, both being around the £175,000 mark. Sales for the two cars didn't perfectly overlap. My car, being a 2010, is a very late Scuderia, where that was the year that this generation of Superleggera was introduced. In all honesty, I think because of the more raw, old-school nature of this car, it's much fairer to compare it with the Scuderia than, say, the Speciale. And today, prices again of those two are much closer. A Speciale now is going to set you back over £300,000, where one of these you could have for half that. As you might imagine though, there were some key differences between the two cars. One is that with this, you could actually order a manual gearbox, not an option on the 430 Scuderia. Sadly, very few people actually did. I believe it's very low double digits in the world. As standard, your colour choice for the Superleggera was green, yellow, orange, those are the three I'd have, white, grey or black, as we have here, Nero Noctis. For Sonny, this car replaced a 991.2 GT3, a car he very much enjoyed, was a manual example, but he wanted that true old-school supercar experience and thought this was going to be the best way to get it. Thanks to the Cannonball Run, it was a black car that he was after, and I have to say, in the flesh, this does look mean. Time, I think, for a musical interlude. Today's orchestra is another way this car differentiates itself from the Ferrari, because there you have a very nice 4.3 litre naturally aspirated V8 making some 510 PS. Here you have a 5.2 litre naturally aspirated V10, as you would find in something like the Audi R8, and it makes a much healthier 570 horsepower. Torque is also up over the Ferrari, which makes just shy of 350 pound-feet. This makes just shy of 400 pound-feet. And you can feel it. That, in case you're wondering, is 540 Newton-meters. So, engine aside then, on paper, the two are about as close as you could possibly get. What are they actually like to drive though? Well, a very, very different experience indeed. There are certain things about the experience that are not specific to the Superleggera and instead common to all Gallardos. The driving position is one, so you feel in this car like you are several feet further back from the road. You get the impression this is a much, much bigger car, despite the fact I think it's actually the smaller of the two. The real key difference is in the relationship between bodywork, glass and driver. So in the 430 you've got lots of glasswork. It feels like the windscreen is still fairly close and the dash relatively low and unintrusive. Here it's more like being in an Aston Martin, so there's lots of dash in front of you, you can see it. The glass is very low, the roof feels like it's several inches closer to your head, and in reality actually is quite a bit closer to your head, and you do feel that much more cocooned in it. is one element of this car that Lamborghini claimed wasn't changed at all for the Superleggera, and that's the gearbox. But I have a hard time believing they left this alone, because I just asked for a shift in Corsa mode, and what I got, well, it was pretty darn close to what you'd get in the 430 Scuderia or even the Aventador. It was brutal and rather brilliant. Downshifts are absolutely sensational. Those really are just as good as you could possibly hope for in any car, full stop. No complaints. Listen. Ah, music to my ears. My only real frustration is that it's very long geared, so to be able to get all of that glorious V10 Symphony for you, I do have to do those pulls in first, which is quite entertaining, I have to say. Like the Ferraris, if you do want the full bore shift, you need a certain amount of RPM and a certain amount of throttle input, otherwise it will be slow. But you know what? The gearbox for me, I thought was going to be a weak point in this car. It's not. It also just dawned on me that I totally neglected to mention one of the really big differences between this and the Ferrari. This has four-wheel drive. It also has quite a few other creature comforts, so it has a stereo, which is actually pretty decent, annoyingly so. It's certainly a quieter car to be in this. It feels a little less stripped out than the Ferrari. You also have a reversing camera, which I would really quite like in the Ferrari too. And I think this is a car that for some could be a little bit easier to daily drive. I say for some because there are several areas where the Ferrari does claw back some credibility. First off, storage in all Gallardos, and in fact many Lamborghinis, is very compromised. It's pathetic, really. The front boot is absolutely minuscule, and you've got a small parcel shelf behind you, but if you want to do a long distance journey in this, good luck to you. The other issue is the fact this car is very stiff. As far as I can tell, there are no adaptive dampers in this car. They certainly don't mention them on the spec sheet. And the car suffers for it. As you might imagine, like the 430 Scuderia, it's lower and stiffer than the regular car. It in fact also wears exactly the same size tyres. 235s up front, 285s out the back. Those are wrapped around some rather gorgeous looking 19-inch wheels. Sonny wanted the black and gold effect on the car, and I have to say, it suits it to a T. It's this sort of stuff here where I wish this car had a bumpy road mode of its own, because it's, really quite frustrating. Ground clearance on the car is actually surprisingly decent, and at no point has it tried to tap the ground, though on this particular test route there shouldn't be anywhere where any car really does that. That being said, one thing this car does have, which I wish the 430 did, is front lift. So for going into car parks and the like, that is a helpful thing to have. However, as you might imagine, there is a price to pay for all of this. Yes, the car is genuinely 70 plus kilos lighter than a regular 560-4. But that's already a car much heavier than the F430. Lamborghini and Ferrari, being Italian, they love to quote dry weights, which honestly are absolutely meaningless. My dry weight is 45 kilos, but try and use that on a dating profile and you're going to get in trouble. Ferrari claim their car is something like 1,250 kilos, Lamborghini claim 1,350, and the actual difference isn't that far off. So the site that I use weighed a 430 Scuderia and they got 1,400 kilos. This 1,484, which is very interesting for a couple of reasons. First off, yes, it is genuinely lighter than the regular car, not a surprise, but what was shocking is that it's also quite a bit lighter than the older Superleggera, the Gen 1 based car. If you have a hard time remembering which one is which, the earlier car has the 5-litre engine, sounds a little bit different, and the front end looks more like the early Murcielago, this like the later one. To put it another way, the early cars look like if they hit you, you would go splat, and these, if they hit you, they'd simply cut you in half. The weight differential between this and the earlier Superleggera is some 45 kilos, a much bigger difference than I expected. This, I think, is not to do with the two different versions of the Superleggera, but the two different versions of the Gallardo, because the cooking versions of the same car are also a similar weight differential. The real shocker, though, was that this car is still, only by about 10 kilos or so, heavier than a Balboni, the LP570-2, and the only thing that really did to save any weight was remove the front-wheel drive. I think somewhere in the world they actually did a version of this car with two-wheel drive, Singapore edition or something like that. That, I think, would be a very interesting car to have, because by the time you shave the front-wheel drive off this thing, it's then going to weigh a very similar amount to the Ferrari, but have a lot more punch. The steering in the Ferrari is certainly superior. This is not bad, it's enjoyable, you know what the car's doing, and you do get the surprising bit of texture here and there through it, but it's just not as good as in the 430. Of all the things about this car, there are only two which are actually a deal breaker. One is the limited storage space. The other is the suspension. Just about everything else about this car I really do like. Love the way that it looks. I love the dash. Very simple, very elegant, very old school, although very difficult to read with this font. I don't mind all the Audi stuff over here. I really, really don't. Old school supercars are just like that, and it actually works and you can get parts for it and everything else. The stereo actually is quite nice to have. I would love that. I'd appreciate that. If I had a car like this, I would drive it and use it, and actually it would be somewhat more usable than the 430 because of these creature comforts. But they've then fitted it with a suspension that's just too much. Oh, I tell you what though, if you just want to go out and have a little blast, or a big one, this is a good way to do it, I tell you. Even in 2022, this is still an impressively fast car. It does the Lamborghini thing, it turns heads, it feels really properly special in here, though make sure you can fit before you purchase. I have a very long torso, so in reality, though I'm 5'10", I'm probably closer in sort of torso height to people like 6'1" or something like that. So, yeah. Really tall people will struggle. There is very little adjustment in this seat. It goes forwards and backwards. That's it. The Ferrari is much better on that front. Happily, these cars have proven to be generally very reliable. Overall maintenance is probably going to be a little bit more than on a Ferrari, but they're likely to be, I think, a little bit more durable. The only items I think on this which are likely to cost you an awful amount are ones that are Superleggera specific. And again, the 430 Scuderia is no different whatsoever. Grip is astonishing. As it happens, from new, the cars were also fitted with essentially the same tyres, Pirelli P0 Corsas. So, if I've convinced you to buy one of these, what's it going to cost you? Well, that's where it gets quite interesting. With the Scuderia, there are generally about 10 or 12 of them for sale, so it's fairly easy to get a handle on what you should pay for what example. Many times I've got to look at what a Superleggera would cost, only to find there are very, very few for sale. Typically only 3 or 4, half of which tend to be the Gen 1. I have seen these listed similar to Scuderia prices, so up to 170, 180, though in reality I think they command a fair bit less. If you could pick one of these up for 140 to 150,000 pounds, I'd say you've got yourself something of a bargain. If these were more like 180,000 pounds, I think they'd be a more difficult sell, because then I'd struggle really to see past an Aventador. Though it would be an early car at that money, they have an added level of drama, excitement, specialness thanks to the V12 in the back over the Audi-derived V10, and believe it or not, they have a little bit more refinement too. However, at 140 grand, yeah, this makes a very, very compelling proposition. In fact, just about the only thing that would really make me look elsewhere would be the Audi R8 GT, which is essentially the R8 version of this. The Lambo, though, will always be the more special car. There we go. I've enjoyed this a lot more than I thought I might. Anyway, All that remains for me to say is a huge thank you to Sonny for bringing this car out, and as ever, to you for watching. Don't forget to hit the like button, comment down below, subscribe if you haven't already, and as ever, I'll see you for the next one, which might be that.